This is Greg Kesich at the Portland Press Herald, and I'm here with Cynthia Dill, Alan Caron, and Bill Nemitz. Maine held hostage day 3. We don't know what the legislature's up to, but we've all been following very closely since Friday. Well, let's go back. How do we get to this point?
Oh, my God. Well, it comes down right now to the fact that the Republicans didn't want a 3% surcharge on income over $200,000. The Democrats caved on that. The Democrats want to replace that $320 million revenue source with about a $20 to $25 million increase in the lodging tax. And the Republicans, led by a governor who proposed the same tax in January, are now saying, no, we're going to shut the state down over that.
I refuse to think it's really about policy or 3% or education funding. I see it as just purely partisan politics, that the House Republicans think they're in Washington and they're trying to play the part of House Republicans down there just saying no for the sake of saying no, because outsiders and anti-establishment types seem to get a lot of press, and Donald Trump's in the presidency and LePage is in the Blaine House, and it's just to me it's just copycat politics.
So you've been in the House and the Senate. Why is the Senate Republican caucus behaving differently than the House Republican caucus?
Well, the Senate collaborates more because there's fewer people. The discussions tend to be more policy-based. There's more collegiality because there's just, lesser numbers. I think the House, it's top-down leadership because there's so many people. A caucus is organized around an agenda that's set by just a few people, whereas in the Senate, everyone sits around a table. There's sort of an equal say among members. Leadership isn't so heavily, they're just not as powerful, I think, in the Senate. I mean, they get pressure from their members that's felt more directly than the House.
Is that how you see it, Alan?
Yeah. I think the whole system's broken down, and I think this is a small group in the House, in both houses, at the national level, the state level, that just think they control everything. And they're so intransigent and so unyielding.
They're not wrong, right? I mean, they actually are controlling everything.
Well, they are,
point.
sure.
Yeah.
And they've been doing it for a long time, and they like it. And look, it goes hand in hand with the veto governor. You got a governor essentially does nothing but veto. You got a House caucus essentially does nothing but veto. And this is the new way that we're governing.
I don't think you can underestimate the influence, however. Cynthia, you mentioned earlier, Trump and LePage being in the same boat right now. I think it really is LePage, because I think that if LePage were to have a change of heart, or if they were to get close enough to his position that he felt comfortable with it, you're not going to see those House Republicans digging in their heels. I mean, as LePage goes, so they will go.
Well, I think that's exactly right.
And this is really coming down to, as I wrote last week, I think this is Paul LePage's 7-year dream come true here. I mean,
to shut the government down.
Yeah, he's fine. I think he considers this part of his legacy.
I do. Well, and the interesting thing, I think, is he's owning the messaging around it. I mean, he's going into the national press saying that he's sticking up for Maine people. He's not going to stick it to the people based on principle. He's coming across as if he's standing up for something, when in fact he's not standing up for anything. This idea that the lodging tax now is what's at the heart of this. I mean, LePage is for raising the lodging tax. All the Democrats voted to raise the lodging tax. Right. It seems to me most people are in agreement that the lodging tax has to be raised, right, to make up the revenue to fund tax cuts or other programs. Every single candidate running for governor. So why don't we just raise the lodging tax?
And at one point on Saturday, they were talking. The Republicans were proposing cutting community college funding. Not by a lot, but somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million. And they're allegedly standing up for principle. But what principle lets you cut community college funding to help somebody get a better job, and at the same time shave $3 off a $200 hotel room?
Oh, and what principle says that going to Scarborough Beach is a necessity? Whereas, I have cases now.
Right now it is.
My caseload against the state of Maine, any email that you send to the Attorney General's office, the response by the lawyers is, sorry, the office is shut down. Mm-hmm. I mean, so that means people's cases. The justice system has come screeching, to a
Right.
halt. But meanwhile, the state beach has to stay open so people can get their, hot dog and a tan. I mean, it's ridiculous.
And we're hearing from defense attorneys who do court-appointed work who are not going to get paid for the work that they do on cases appointed by the courts, but work that they do on cases that's not considered constitutionally
Right.
necessitated.
These are public. Well, not public defenders, but public appointed
Yeah,
attorneys
and
who are already operating in the
Yeah.
red because the state ran out of money in the last budget.
Right.
I could see having this fight if it was over 3% surtax on high incomes. I could see the Democrats digging in and the Republicans digging in. I mean, that's a major philosophical difference that's not easy to bridge. But the Democrats gave up on that before the battle even started. It's done. That's out.
And the problem with that is that, therefore, because they did it so early, it's not really recognized as the huge concession that it was. That was the starting point. And so now, after they do that, LePage and the Republicans are able to look at them and say, you've given us nothing. Well, actually, they've given the Republicans, and remember, this surcharge is the law of the land, they've handed them a $320 million tax cut. And now we're haggling over $20 million?
And I think it comes across that the Republicans, like I said, Paul LePage says in his messaging that he's doing this on principle. He's standing up for the people of Maine. The Democrats could have that message if they had defended the referendum that raised it 3%. But like we just said, they caved early. Cave maybe isn't the right word. But so it appears the Democrats are sticking up for state workers, and that is not a winning campaign
Right.
strategy. So going into it in
With all
like
due
2
respect to
years.
state workers.
Yeah, of course. I mean,
yeah.
I represent a lot of state workers, but
Yeah.
I just think in terms of, the political messaging around this, it's difficult for now Democrats to recover, I think.
I think they could recover quickly, and I think there's a very simple message they could be working, and I'm surprised that they're not working it, which is this is really coming down to now saving tourist money by cutting education funding. I mean, if you boil it all down,
Right.
and if you ask Maine people, would you rather have your school education funding cut, or would you rather have tourists pay more for their hotel rooms? It's not a hard thing
Right.
to answer, but I think they're all in so much chaos up there that nobody can figure out what the simple takeaway, the winning message to me would be tourist or education.
The other
Which
thing that
we
I'm
care
waiting to
about.
see is if they
That's right.
pass a budget with a 2/3 vote and it goes to LePage. Now, that's a huge if right now. The last count, they're still about 8 to 10 votes off. But if that were to happen, and LePage were to be so miffed by that he would start to dip into his 10-day waiting period, the dynamics of this are going to shift dramatically because right now the focus is on both LePage and the House Republicans. If the legislature passes a 2/3 budget right now and it goes to LePage, basically they go home waiting for him to do something. And if he doesn't do something, and if he decides just out of spite to sit on this thing for 10 days, all of that wrath, all of that growing anger among state workers and others, they're not going to be outside the State House. They're going to be outside the Blaine House. And he's going to be alone. So in a lot of ways, I think what the House Republicans are doing right now is provide him cover so that it's not just him. And they're being played like fools.
But for that to happen, Ken Fredette and the House Republican caucus would have to bail on him. To get that situation,
Correct.
you would have to get to, and that's just doesn't look like it's going to happen. It looks like they are right in line, and they have been consistently right in line, and I don't really get for what.
There's a little.
What are they fighting for? What do they want?
I know.
How do you negotiate with somebody who doesn't want anything?
Right, I know. They just want it. But there is a little attrition. I mean, I believe today, in the most recent House vote, that number went from about 87 up to about 93, I think it was.
Yeah, I mean,
So-
now it's a numbers game. You just
so-
wait out the clock.
So there are some Republicans peeling off there. And as I said, the real fun hasn't begun yet. This is a holiday weekend. You are not going to see the circus in Augusta that we saw 26 years ago until we get into the work week. And
And ironically, I think the Democrats are actually holding a pretty good hand right now. And time is their ally.
I think so too.
You know, and the longer it goes, the worse the heat's going to get, the more pressure, and you're going to see peeling off. And then you're going to see a conflict between the caucus in the House and LePage. And then what I was just talking about is if they get to the point where they have enough votes and they pass the thing and LePage sits on it
Right.
for 10 days, while all these people are out of work, while all these services aren't being provided, I just think that the whole thing starts to boil on
Well,
him.
do you think that they're going to stick with the lodging tax? Because that's
Not
to
if
me.
they get 12 hours of rest. I mean, do you really want to put the state government, make the state government hostage over at 1 penny or a penny and a half?
Symbolically, it's become a big thing because the Democrats have said all along, after they stepped away from the surcharge, that nevertheless they need some kind of dedicated new funding stream for education. Now they're at $162 million, yet what are we, under $25 million on the lodging tax. But if they give that up, I think this is why it's so important to them. If they give that up, we are right back where we were before, pledging 55% of state funding, 55% of the cost of education, but no real revenue streams to get there.
And hoping we have a surplus like we did this year. And
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I think what's going to happen is that the legislature members are going to just stop showing up. There's going to be plenty of people who have vacations planned. They have things that they have to do, and they're just going to stop showing up. And this is when the real tricky politics comes into play of holding a vote at 12:30 at midnight when so-and-so's down at the bar and so-and-so is home at camp, and just trying to make some deals with some House Republicans. It's going to take some really shrewd horse trading.
So when they say that we need 101 votes, is that just an expression, or do they actually need 101 votes to pass the budget?
Well, that's a good question. I'm trying to recall if it's 2/3 present, or if it's. It seems to me it has to be 2/3 present.
Well, I wonder if it's emergency legislation, if that requires a 2/3 vote, as opposed to like a veto override.
Yeah,
we'll skip over the part we don't know.
Right.
We'll go,
Yeah.
We'll just stick to just their speculation.
Right.
Alan, you said the Democrats look like they have a pretty good hand here. Who else is looking good? I mean, I would think the speaker is looking very good. I think.
I think the
Sarah
speaker's done a
Gideon is-
decent job, and I am dying to hear the details of that little
In the Blaine
negotiation they
House.
had in the
Right.
Blaine House, because it seems to me there's more to that story than the speaker will tell right now.
Sounds like it got very.
But I think there was some, we'll say, bullying as the polite way, and some into your space aggression from the governor. This is what I understand.
It
And
also felt
that's a
like-
story that needs to be told.
It felt like a setup to me.
Right.
Because I was watching Twitter when that happened. That's about how you keep up minute to minute on Friday night. And the moment,
Kind of ruined the weekend for
Yeah,
my family,
right.
actually.
it was almost before, but it was at least simultaneous with when Sarah Gideon left the Blaine House. You get these quote unquote news sites that the Republicans have set up on Twitter. And one of them was reporting her exit from the Blaine House literally as it happened. So that tells me that this was not by accident, that they were looking for a way to make her break away from the three other leaders and walk out of the Blaine House so that they could say, look, she's no longer participating in the negotiations. But what in fact happened was LePage, I think, was so over the top in his, what she called aggressive behavior.
And my understanding is that
walked.
he came across the table. He came over the table at her. So I want to have that confirmed at some point, because I know Sarah Gideon very well. She's a neighbor and friend, and she is a very thoughtful person. But she can also be really tough.
I was going to say he met his match when it
Yeah,
comes to that.
and
I mean,
if he
thinks
thought
pulling
that,
a
that
bullying
coming,
thing.
hovering over her and being really aggressive and in her face was going to move her opinion, he miscalculated terribly. But, and again, she won't necessarily talk about that now. There are bigger things to talk about. But in the end, we want to know what happened
I
there.
think Troy Jackson will tell us what happened.
Well, and I think you asked who looks good. I think Mike Thibodeau, the Senate president, looks really good in terms of just his ability to communicate simply what is obviously not a simple situation, but also his willingness to work with Sarah Gideon. They have obviously a good relationship, and this, between the Senate Republicans and the House Democrats, I think there's enough people to get to where we need to go eventually. But it just feels like we have a temper tantrum going on by some spoiled brat. I think Governor LePage just comes across to me as such a spoiled brat.
Yeah, I mean, to me too, and but he always does. And I think this is one of those situations where the people who don't like the way he leads the state don't like him even more. Mm-hmm. And the people who do like it, same thing. It just sort of intensifies where people are. I heard that he took the House Republicans into the Blaine House on Friday morning and told them, "Hold out. I've got a deal. I've got a budget that'll get us over the top." And they did their part. And then Friday night rolled around, and he didn't have a budget.
It was a 2-sentence concept.
He had this. Yeah, he had a couple of talking points that included things that you couldn't put in the budget anyway. Maybe you shouldn't have fired the budget director 2 weeks ago. And
Water over the dam.
And then Ken Fredette comes out acting as if this was all their idea. And he can't even get his talking points straight. He's got one set on Saturday morning, and another Saturday afternoon, and then another on Sunday. But I don't see where anybody's mind gets changed in any of this stuff. So this dynamic where you have kind of equal but opposing forces in stalemate could just go forever.
Except
the
heat will go up. And I think that's, by the end of the week, Friday, Saturday, if we're still in this mode, at some point, the physical presence of so many people, the anger that they're expressing, just the spectacle of it all becomes impossible to ignore. I think in a lot of ways that's what happened back in '91. I mean, the powers that be were freaking out. I mean, the people were taking over the State House.
Let's
I know,
go back
but I'm
to
also
that. Were you around then?
Yes. Yep. I was in my second year at Thompson, McNamara, Ashley and Bull, working as a lawyer on Exchange Street, and married in Maine and here. And I recall the budget shutdown. It didn't have a significant impact on me personally because I wasn't in politics. I didn't have kids in the school. I was in private practice. I just remember thinking, this is kind of weird.
Uh-huh.
It was just an odd thing. But what I recall
Before
coming
Newt
out
Gingrich
of it
started shutting down the government all the time. Right?
Here's the thing. What I recall coming out of it was, even though I was not political then, and I don't recall who won or lost, the Republicans took the blame. But what I recall coming out of that budget, or the government shutdown, was an overhaul of the workers' compensation system, which significantly and substantially impacted the way attorneys are paid. Because I remember, that. And so to Governor McKernan's credit, I think that the overhaul of the Maine workers' comp system now is recognized nationally as like a leader in reform. So even though people point politically to Republicans as the cause of that shutdown, I still think the Republicans came out okay.
Yeah, it was rooted in a principle in which they believed.
Right.
What is this rooted in?
Right.
Yeah.
What is the overarching principle that's driving this shutdown? I don't think you can.
It's a
find
pilot program for a statewide teachers contract.
I think the principle that's being tested in Maine and the different states that are shut down and Washington is this principle of whether or not we can govern ourselves. This anti-government governing faction, whether they're going to make the case continually that they send us to Washington, send us Augusta, so we can break things up and tear it all down. And now people are seeing that's what they do. They go up to Washington or go up to Augusta, go down to Washington, and they don't govern. They are ideologues. They stick to a position even if they don't believe in it. And as a result, we have this complete dysfunction. So hopefully, I think, since in my view, the principle at stake is, do you believe in government or not? At the election, maybe we'll be able to capitalize on this and get better candidates. And I don't know.
One thing, I have a house that the oldest part was built in 1790, And if I've learned one thing over the past 15 years, it's a hell of a lot easier to tear something down than it is to build it.
Yeah.
And that's really what we're dealing with. That's how these folks operate. Just tear it apart and walk away?
Yeah, burn it down.
So I remember the aftermath of 91 was a distaste in incumbents, and it wasn't particularly aimed at either party. It was well, I was working for the Forecaster, northern suburbs, and there was a number of races for the legislature that, including the one I'm thinking of is Nancy Clark, who was the Senate majority leader for a long time, and Phil Harriman, who nobody had ever heard of, ran against her, and he bought a full-page ad in the Forecaster. We loved it, with a picture of Nancy Clark, Charlie Prey, who was the president of the Senate, and John Martin, and said, you know, it was like the axis of evil. These three are tearing our state apart. And then, you know, smiling, handsome Phil, and I think there was a lot of races like that, and I think it carried through. Right up until 94, when Angus King ran as an outsider.
And term limits were
I thought there was a big loser in 1991, though. It was Jock McKernan. I remember I was running a campaign in 1991 on widening the turnpike.
Yeah.
And Jock McKernan
Vote yes to stop the widening.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yes, we can.
Right.
Great messaging.
Jock McKernan was so toxic in that year. The Democrats were running Jock McKernan photos also, but he was so toxic that the people who were in favor, the chambers of commerce and all the business groups and Sand and Gravel Boys who were in favor of widening the turnpike, forced him out of the picture. He wanted to speak out on that issue, and they said, don't. And when it looked like they were so certain to win, late in the campaign, Jock McKernan made a public statement, and I turned it overnight into an ad with his picture, and just associated him with that issue, and the numbers moved 20 points in 5 days. Now, it wasn't just because his picture was in that ad, but he was really toxic. And then, of course, 3 years later, you have Angus King, who becomes the anti-party candidate in parks on both houses. So.
Right.
But early on, because McKernan was the governor, in the end, the governor is the one who gets most of the blame in these things, because that's the one most known. Mm-hmm. That's the one you send to run the stuff. So
I hope that some of the business leaders in Maine start to speak up, because that's really who I think people just don't trust legislators and politicians now. They don't trust the media, and there's this desire to want somebody they trust to say something meaningful. So if, like, for instance, I don't know if this could ever happen, but like IDEX, WEC, some of these big companies need to weigh in, like, okay, if state government shuts down, this is how it impacts our business, because it can't just be about the state workers. It can't just be about the unions up in Augusta, chanting. I have a memory of what happened in Wisconsin when everyone thought, oh, these huge crowds in the State House are going to, cause their governor to, he just, was emboldened by their efforts to recall and undo what he was doing in the same vein that LePage is doing. So I think it can't be just elected officials and union members protesting the government shutdown. It has to be the private sector.
And that starts with the road contractors, who are all itching to get to work right now.
They'll
A
be the
legislator
first ones.
posted on his Facebook, he was driving up to the State House, I think in Freeport, and there was one of those electric signs on the main drag that said, paving starts July 5th, and he wrote in his Facebook, I don't think so.
Yeah.
Is it just a coincidence that other states are shutting down at the same time, or are we? Is this some kind of like team effort?
It's just the Koch brothers
by
at work.
The Republican Governors Association to.
I think it's in the DNA. I mean, you look at all it's like, Chris Christie, Paul LePage, they just seem to be in the same ilk, the same guys who are going to bust up government, and they're sticking it to the state, useless unions and blah, blah, blah. I don't see any policy that they're necessarily sharing, but it's the same attitude towards government and towards elected officials who are trying to do their job. I mean, you go up to Augusta and you talk to some of the people on that committee, and they don't agree with what necessarily is coming down. The conference committee, then the appropriations committee, and if you go up to Augusta thinking that you're only going to vote for things that you absolutely believe in, and you're not going to vote against, it's just like, then you shouldn't have the job of being a representative official. You're not cut out, or you don't have the qualifications to govern if you can't reach a compromise when it comes to these basic things like a budget.
So I was reading the Declaration of Independence today, because that's what editorial writers do on the day before the 4th of July.
I thought Herb Adams does that.
Yeah, no, I don't read it aloud. I'm like, is there anything I can get an editorial out of on a holiday? And it struck me that, the part that we always quote is the part about our self-evident rights endowed by our Creator. But really what we're celebrating is the birth of the government. We had those rights according to that document before July 4th, 1776. What changed then was we were going to govern ourselves, and that's really all about government. And it's distressing how low esteem we hold government. I mean, collectively, all of us, and all these other institutions that are important to making a government function. Everything from the court system to the public schools to the police departments. You really have a hard time finding any major institution in this country that has a great deal of confidence from the public, and certainly not the media. Boy, everybody bummed out.
We're in awe. He actually came up with an editorial.
Yeah. Well, I guess what people have to do then is stop thinking about how bad government is and try to imagine a world without it. So what's the alternative? I mean, that's the challenge. It's so easy to poke holes in or burn down, as we said, what's there for government, but then what? I mean, you look what happened over in the Middle East after, the revolutions to get rid of these despots and dictators. Well, the void was just filled by worse, just worse situations. I don't know. I challenge the people, the House Republicans in Washington and Augusta, to come up with some vision of America that actually does what these documents that they're always waving around, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, say government's supposed to do. Like, how are they going to get it done if they can't work with other people in politics to do it?
And government may not this shutdown may not affect any of us immediately right now on Monday, July 3rd. But the longer these things, we do all at one point or another interact with government. And at that point, government becomes much less of the enemy and much more of the facilitator. And so the longer this shutdown goes on, the more Mainers, whether it's a license, whether it's whatever, are going to run into that brick wall. And collectively, there will be this growing consciousness that, yeah, we really do need this government. Right. I need this government. I need it to do X, Y, and Z. So 16 days in 1991, we're at 3 days now?
Yeah.
The pain, I think, increases exponentially as these things go on. And by the time it's over, the citizenry, I think, has a much greater appreciation for why government's there in the first place.
And to tie that point together with Cynthia's point made earlier about how do you get pressure from the business community, I don't think Paul LePage is going to respond to what the unions do or even people arguing out there. What he will respond to is the sand and gravel boys losing work.
Right.
Yeah.
And starting Wednesday,
and wait till they start
Right.
showing
they are
up at the
losing
State
work.
House.
And
Right,
then
right.
there's this other range of small businesses that begin to lose contracts. They begin to lose checks they're waiting for. So you're right. I mean, it just.
What about the hospitals?
Well,
right?
and what about the
these,
drug addicts? I mean, the thing a difference between 1991 and now, I think, is that psychologically, people were better equipped to deal with a government shutdown. Whereas right now, we have a very fragile community. We have people who are scared because there's instability in Washington, and we have a crackpot for a president, and there's drug addicts in their family who they never thought could possibly be drug addicts, and there's no treatment for drug addiction. So it's like, I just think this government shutdown is different than 91 because as a people, we're a little bit more vulnerable.
A little more on edge.
Yeah.
Well, the government may be shutting down, but we're not shutting down, and we'll all be back next week.
Happy 4th of July.
Happy 4th of July.
Fireworks.
So before we go, I wanted to reach out to Jim Fossel, one of our Sunday columnists who we usually can't talk to because he's working, but he's a state employee, and so he is off today. And how you doing, Jim?
Hey, how's it going?
So by the time this comes out, it may be resolved. The whole issue may be resolved, or the details of it will certainly have changed. But can you talk a little bit about what are the underlying principles here? What are the Democrats and the Republicans and the different bodies of the legislature fighting over?
Well, it seems like the biggest issue is really about taxes at this point. The House Republicans and the governor, rightly, I think, don't want to have any kind of lodging tax increase or any kind of net tax increase in the budget. And there's some other issues floating around there too, like the education funding formula and some policy issues. But most of those seem to be getting accepted into the compromise budget at this point. It really is right now, as we speak on Monday, down to taxes, it looks like.
And it's really down to this one tax. I mean, I heard the governor say that he would sign a budget that didn't have this lodging tax in it. And
right. So it seems like he's zeroing in on the lodging tax, but it also seems like House Republicans still want more policy issues in it. So
right.
It's unclear to me exactly where things are. But
right. So is that a big enough issue to shut down government over 1.5 cents on a lodging tax going from 9 to 10.5? We're talking $3 on a $200 hotel room.
Well, of course, it's not really. When I say it's about the lodging tax, I mean it's not really just about the lodging tax. The Democrats were saying earlier today that if they took some Democrats were saying that if they took out the lodging tax, and they should put back in the 3% surcharge. So, it seems like the Democrats really want a tax increase of some kind, and Republicans really don't want any tax increases.
Mm-hmm. But I guess what I'm questioning is, I think you're right. If it had been the 3% surtax, you could see that's the kind of big principled issue that could shut down government. But this seems to be there's a lot of subtext going on here when they're fighting over something so small.
Yeah, there is, and that's why I say that it's hard to say exactly where we stand in these things now, because there are all these closed-door negotiations going back and forth. The papers are being moved back and forth, but it's hard to tell what kind of progress is really being made. If they're shutting down or not passing the budget over the question of raising education spending without having any education reform, I think that's a good debate. But this is a debate that should have happened a lot earlier in the session.
I mean, didn't it happen? There was legislation to do all this stuff. It did, but it happened basically
just by shooting down all the reform bills that the Republicans put up. So there wasn't much of an actual discussion about any of the education reform, and the Democrats seem to think that they deserve to get, because the referendum passed, they deserve to get some kind of spending increase without giving in on any policy items, which isn't practical, and I'm glad they backed away from that. But I think it's going to be tough to get a budget passed that has no tax increases in it. Mm-hmm. They also seem hell-bent on raising taxes.
And the other side seems equally hell-bent on keeping the shutdown going. Although, actually, let's back up a little bit, because the Senate Republicans, with one exception, all voted for the compromise budget that had a tax increase. So it's not just Democrats and Republicans. It's Democrats, Senate Republicans against the House Republicans and the governor.
Right, and the other interesting thing too is that had this entire debate taken place a month ago, we would be just fine.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they probably would have been able to pick off enough Republicans in the House to pass the budget and override the veto, and they would have gotten a budget. But the legislature also dilly-dallied and delayed for months, giving LePage a lot of sway in this, obviously.
Sure. The Democrats gave a lot of ground. They gave up on the 3% surcharge. They gave up from another smaller surcharge on even higher income. But that seems to be lost in the messaging today.
Well, right, and I think it's the interesting thing too is that because those that was passed by the referendum, I think there are probably a lot of Democrats in the legislature who never really wanted the surcharge in the first place.
I think you're right. Yeah.
So they were perfectly willing to give it up because they never really advocated for it anyway.
Yeah.
So they're not really giving up anything big on in their side. They're giving up something that the Maine People's Alliance wanted.
They certainly didn't fight for it that hard.
Yeah, exactly. And the question is whether that referendum was ever really intended to pass or whether it was just intended to be a bargaining chip all along.
So our editorials going back to January have said that the people voted to increase education spending, and it's the legislature's job to figure out how to do that, how to accomplish that.
But, as I pointed out in my column a couple of weeks ago, everybody's always happy to increase spending and cut taxes, but nobody actually ever wants to figure out how to pay for any of it.
Right. So this was an...
So, when you have a referendum to raise taxes on somebody else and increase spending with no cost to you, yeah, sure, that sounds great. A lot of people are going to vote for it. But the devil's in the details.
Mm-hmm. Now, when our conversation with the panel, a lot of attention came back to the governor. And the governor's role in this seems to be him asserting himself in this process in a forceful way. And I'm wondering if it's a result of him being kind of not feeling he was treated with enough respect.
Well, right. I think we all saw 2 years ago how displeased he was when the legislature essentially ignored his budget and wrote their own.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he wanted a conversation like this then, but it didn't happen. And he, marshaled his forces and worked on it and is now trying to reinsert himself and get something done while he's still in office.
Were you surprised by how little he really asked for when we finally saw what his demands were?
By how little he asked for and at which point?
Starting on Friday night, I assume that the budget points that came through Ken Fredette were coming from the Blaine House. Yeah.
I was. I mean, he could have asked for the moon, right? He could have asked for right to work or a bigger tax cut or anything he wanted, basically. Because he had the legislature over the knee at that point, but he didn't. He included some things in there that shouldn't have been in there, like repealing ranked choice voting, but he quickly gave up on that one. It seems to me like right now at this point, either they can resolve it this week and get things passed fairly quickly, or this could last all month. It's either one or the other. It's not going to be resolved in 2 weeks. It's not going to be resolved next weekend. It's going to be resolved either today or tomorrow or not for 30 days.
And if it does continue into the future, where does the pressure fall?
Well, I think the pressure will fall on the House Republicans who are facing re-election next year. Obviously, both Governor LePage and Ken Fredette aren't running for re-election. So they don't have to worry about public pressure. I'm sure Ken is concerned about his members and getting the majority back. But the question is, if this thing drags on, will public pressure really be on them, or will it just be on everybody to, hey, just do your job and pass a budget? That's my question. And I think, talking to coworkers and friends and other state employees, I think most people don't just really just want to see the legislature do their job and pass a budget. Mm-hmm. That's why I wrote this week that I thought it was going to hurt both parties, not just the House GOP.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we were talking with the other panel, and that was the recollection of what happened the last time. Is that it led to an independent governor and a lot of turnover in the legislature, term limits.
Yeah, and I think that could certainly happen again. I mean, last time the shutdown not only led to a lot of the turnover in the legislature, but also it basically led to eventually getting rid of John Martin and term limits and clean elections.
When is it we're going to get rid of John Martin?
Well, we tried once, didn't we?
It seems like every term limits got rid of everybody else. But,
I know. Trump almost got rid of everybody except for John Martin, who was the reason we passed him in the first place. But no, I mean, the reverberations from the 91 shutdown lasted for a number of years,
yes.
including electing Angus King as governor, including helping to elect Angus as governor. So we could see a similar thing here. We could enter into really chaotic territory where it's going to have a huge impact, and it's hard to say exactly politically how it's going to play out. Mm-hmm. Especially with this group trying to elect independents to the legislature.
Yeah.
I mean, they could, like I said this week in the column, they could benefit greatly from this chaos in Augusta.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else? I mean, do you see any of the gubernatorial contenders benefiting from a bad feeling about government?
Well, I think any moderate gubernatorial candidate would benefit next year. Whether that's an independent like Terry Hayes or Susan Collins or somebody else, anybody who seems reasonable and measured and competent as a candidate would really benefit from either party. So I think that it will certainly affect the next governor's race. I think it will hurt Mary Mayhew quite a bit.
Why is that?
Because she was part of the administration.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that this is going to hurt the administration's
I think it will, but most of them aren't going to be running for office again. So It's really going to most directly impact Mary because she's running for governor.
Mm-hmm. And do you think it hurts one party more than another? I mean, I guess we don't know how it winds up, but if it were to continue for a long time.
Like I said, I think it'll hurt both parties. I think it'll hurt a lot of incumbent legislators in both parties. Mm-hmm. You know, unfortunately, it might even hurt moderate legislators who actually did vote for the budget and didn't want to have a shutdown, and might even hurt them. You know, people might just be pissed off and vote against everybody.
Right.
I could easily see that happening. And like I said, then it would be extremely chaotic and difficult to say how it's going to affect the elections. But I think anybody who says it's going to only hurt Democrats or only hurt Republicans is playing a really one-dimensional game here.
Yeah. Well, hey, thanks for being available, and I hope you're much busier next week. And thanks to everybody for listening. We're going to be watching this closely. We'll be back next week unless something really big happens.
This is a Press Herald podcast. You can hear past episodes at pressherald.com/podcasts. You can subscribe on iTunes, on Android devices, and stream on Stitcher. Please email comments and questions to letterstotheeditor@pressherald.com. Thank you for listening.